Hey, Lord Brian, how's it going today? Glowplasma 221 here, back in today to talk about Weekly Shonen Jump, issue number 48 of 2024. And this is a little bit of a weird week of reading Jump for me, because normally whenever I sit down and read Jump, I always do it in the same orderly fashion. It is the fashion I normally go through and talk about the chapters in these videos. Normally start with Undead Unluck, Hunter x Hunter, Kagurabachi, Re-Dragon, One Piece up in there somewhere, and like just go through. Normally it's like, hey, the battle shonen first, like get all of those out of the way, then like a few, maybe like the Ruru Dragon is like a slice of life halfway in between there, then normally into the newbies, whatever they are, until eventually getting into the last four series of like Akane-banashi, Blue Box, Elusive Samurai, and Witch Watch. That's how I normally read Jump every week. And this issue of Jump, I really wasn't feeling it really for the first half of this issue, right? It was actually, yeah, it was the last half of this issue, whenever I was like, damn, this is actually a good issue, all things considered. Because sort of what happened was like, hey, we started with like Undead Unluck, Hunter x Hunter, Kagurabachi, and those are all fine. I mean, they are good series, don't get me wrong whatsoever, and I had very much fun reading them. But it wasn't really until I got down to Astro Royale. And then from there, I was like, damn, I actually really like this issue Jump, because initially I wasn't feeling like I'd be recording a video on this issue just so I could get out the next Shonen Jump video quicker, so I could be a little bit more caught up on Jump quicker than I normally am. And because I've been, as I've said in videos, I've been a few weeks behind for the past few weeks, so I'm trying to like catch up. Like normally I can only get one video done a week, and I'm trying to like really expedite this week, like only do Shonen Jump and Kagurabachi videos till I'm caught back up and not any like other intermingling videos or whatever it is. But this week, I sort of just got to a point where I'm like, damn, there was actually so much that was stacked in the later half of this Jump issue. I'm like, all right, it doesn't matter. I have to sit down and talk about this stuff 110%. And it's going to be a little bit weird today, because normally I'd be starting off with like a One Piece or an Undead Unluck, but instead I am going all the way down to halfway through the series I normally read, and we're going to be starting with Astro Royale today, which is like, normally I think Astro Royale is sort of like mid, but like for some reason this chapter just was like, damn, that's actually sort of good. But we will get into that in a second. As normal with these videos, this is a mini episode of the series. I'm not talking about everything I read in Jump, just the best, or not the best 6 things, just the 6 things I wanted to talk about, right? If you want to hear my thoughts on the Kagurabachi, of course, chapter number 55 from this issue of Weekly Shonen Jump, I have another dedicated video on Kagurabachi and all other Kagurabachi chapters up on the channel. If I'm doing my video stuff right, it should be out the day before this video comes out, so it should already be up there. And if you want to get my thoughts on that chapter in like 30 minutes, I have that video there. But these chapters will not be talked about for 30 minutes straight, because if they were, I would be going mentally insane. But yeah, with that, all of these 6 timestamps will be down. You can see them on the video there. And then at the end of the video, of course, we'll go through and I will show you my rankings of all of the chapters, being that I've already ranked them. So yeah, with that out of the way, I'd say let's just go and hop into Astro Royale, chapter number 27. This chapter is titled Kuran versus Harumi, right? So, we sort of start off this chapter with a little bit of like a map of Plant Zero and where everything is sort of going on, and all of these sort of matchups that we are getting, right? We see that, of course, Hibaru and Himuro are going to be facing off, Tarasu and Fuka. And of course, as we will focus on mainly in this chapter, Kuran and Harumi. We also get a little bit of a note of like, hey, Rari and Kimpa are also together, and they're just in a completely different part of the plant than everybody else is, right? The chapter sort of like formally starts with Hibaru sort of just like going like, oh man, so Tarasu must be above us, and like, where's Kuran, of course, after his big attack splitting everybody up last chapter. And he looks down below on the grating that he's standing on, and he sees Kuran and of course Harumi standing down below there, right? Himuro's like, hey, pay attention to me. Like, if you try to spread out your forces, at least pay attention to me and not to like all the other people going around here. Like, hey, it's not going to work out for you because you made a grievous mistake. Like, hey, my subordinates have taken enhancement drugs specifically designed for fighting against asteroids. Their determination for combat abilities far surpass yours, and they're fully prepared to die, right? And especially now, of course, getting that whole idea across, Himuro's like, Actually, I sort of, whenever I read this chapter, I think the reason I enjoyed it so much was because I did voices for all the characters, and I meant to do them here, but I just sort of forgot, but we'll sort of hop into that for the rest of the chapter. Himuro's in like, yes, especially for Harumi, the sea he's perfectly suited for sea battles, pretty much, right? And Ibaru's like, oh yeah, well, he's up against the Yotsurugi family's toughest fighter, so it won't be so simple. And Himuro's like, hey, ha, give it a break. Harumi's the next pro. Don't compare him to an amateur. And Ibaru's like, oh wow, a pro? As we now look down below to where Kuran is standing right in front of, who's his face? I forgot his name already. Harumi. As we see Harumi is sitting there, and he's sort of like got his arms outstretched. He's got this intricate like tattoo on his body, which has sort of a trident embezzlement in the middle, right? And he's like, hello, since I'm gonna kill you, little man, I'll let you know my other name. It's Poseidon. And Kuran's like, wait, what? That tattoo? A wrestler I was obsessed with when I was a kid had one just like it. The sea god who ruled over 1,000 seas. Are you Harumi Star Poseidon? The star isn't like the word star, it's like just the icon star in between Harumi and Poseidon. But Kuran sees this like, oh my god, I can't believe it. As of course, who we now know is the 6th Investigation Unit, Kaito Harumi, an ex-pro wrestler, also known as Harumi Poseidon, then just says, oh, so you've heard of me then? And Kuran's like, oh, heard of you? Not only have I heard of you, but I'm your biggest fan. Please shake my hand. And he like holds out his hand in front of Poseidon, or in front of Harumi Poseidon, and Harumi's just like, oh wow, I can tell you're serious, kid. Thanks for doing all of this, right? We all see that Kuran's Cheshire cat tail is shaking this entire time. He's like really excited to meet one of his role models, right? And Kuran's like, oh, cool, man. Can I have your autograph or something? And Harumi's like, hey, are you forgetting where we are right now? And he's like, nah, like that, come on, that was a joke. Nothing would make me happier than sparring with my role model. He's like, I can't wait. And Harumi Poseidon is just like, oh, so you still want to fight even though you know who I am? So you're a real man, huh? Of course, going into like the whole thing of like, yes, this is how Kenwakui's works have happened. There's just like a whole bunch of masculinity just like shoved into him, like, oh yeah, you're a man, so we're gonna fight together, right? The two of them eventually get into fighting. They sort of lock their fists together, like push back and forth, until we just see that Harumi just is like overpowering Kuran in almost every single way. He uses a German suplex, and he does a bunch of these other things, and he's like, hey, but you have to remember, I have my Astro. And he uses his Kraken ability to pretty much bring streams of water out, and they just completely pummel Kuran over and over and over again. Harumi then just does more moves. He does a drop kick. He does a power bomb. He just does all of this, right? He just says like, hey, what do you think of a pro wrestler's strength combined with Astro power, right? And Kuran's like, oh my god, what the hell is this going on here, right? As Harumi's just like, hey, I'll keep a hold of it and then launch my water attack, Kraken! As we now see that, of course, they're on a graded surface. What happens is the water just builds up under Kuran and pushes up on him as, of course, Harumi. Harumi just holds Kuran down as his water is sort of blasting up on him, right? And Harumi just says like, hey, like I really hate doing this to a fan, but it's time for you to drown. Like, don't hold it against me, though. I ain't like I was back then. No matter how hard I trained, my injuries held me back. But then Himuro recruited me. I wanted to change, and I wanted to shine again. As Kuran then uses his Cheshire cat ability, and suddenly turns into an octopus, right? As yes, oh, so is that why you ran away from the ring? And of course, our main guy here, Harumi. If you can't tell, I'm forgetting his name almost every time I say it, so I'm having to scroll back into chapter where they say Harumi. But Harumi's just like, oh, he turned into an octopus, is that it? As Kuran just says like, hey, that's sad. You neglected your own power and relied on somebody else's power instead. What a shame. As we see that he comes out of this tentacle, or out of the octopus transformation, and sort of reappears behind where, Harumi is. I sort of remember that time, but he appears right behind where Harumi is, and just like goes around and suddenly turns his top half into a snake as he just goes and coils up around Harumi, and Kuran just says like, hey, Astros come from the power of wishes. Don't you think it's pointless to wield strength of someone else's feelings? You inspired people with your dreams, so you should see them through to the bitter end. And he just says, hey, and I'll be the one to close the curtains on you, Harumi Poseidon. Shine bright and fade away. As he grabs Harumi around the waist and just does a German suplex to him and just bends backwards and smacks him on the ground. As Kuran just says, hey, thanks for the dreams, Harumi Poseidon. And that is where we end this chapter of Astro Royale. It is really just a one-on-one fight chapter between these two, but I don't know why, but just the whole introduction of like, oh, hey, this guy is apparently a pro wrestler named Harumi Poseidon, and he's got this weird thing going on where he's got like the whole water motif, and he's also known as Poseidon, and Kuran watched him as a kid, and then Kuran sort of like puts him down in the very end. I don't know why, I just really like this chapter and like the whole thing between the two of them, and I really just love seeing Kuran's abilities in action of like, hey, it's not a shield, and it's also just not a gun fist, pretty much. He's got a unique power of the transformation, and seeing how he uses those transformations, turning into an octopus and turning into a human-octopus hybrid, and then into a snake to coil up Harumi, it's just so interesting through and through, and I just really love seeing Kuran in this chapter. And also, I think something else that did it was seeing Kuran sort of like have his hair not in that like weird afro thing that he normally has in it, sort of like all matted down. I just really like that look for Kuran, and this was just a really fun chapter, and I don't know why, this chapter was so endearing to me for some reason, but it sort of is what it is there. It feels even weird now knowing that I've got 5 series left, and I'm talking about the last 5 series that I read in Jump today, because, like, yes, Astro Royale is, like, series number, let me do math here real quick. It's about series number 9 or so I read, if in, like, a normal week where we have everything. And then these next few are all the ones I read last, so, like, it's just a little weird, like, hey, the back end of Jump I read this week was just so incredibly stacked, right? But the next chapter is Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi, chapter number 18. This chapter is titled The Naraku High School Occult Investigation Club. A little bit of a long title there, but it really gets in that whole idea of like, yes, hey, we are talking about occult clubs because, of course, why wouldn't we, right? So we pretty much start off with a little bit of narration, just saying like, hey, to honor Kiyoshi's becoming the youngest exorcist ever to be promoted to Grand Cross, him and everybody are celebrating together, right? As we see that everybody is at the Gates of Hell restaurant. We pretty much see that Kiyoshi is there. We see that Nihon, Jack, Joe, Akari, and of course Mr. Sasaki are all sort of sitting around here, right? And Kiyoshi's like, oh, hey guys, thank you so very much for like throwing this party for me and everything, right? Sasaki pretty much explains like, hey, the headmaster told him what happened during the entire test and pretty much how he really messed up Old Man Yana during the entire thing. But eventually, Sasaki just is like, hey, Kiyoshi, you did 100% good with that, right? And Kiyoshi's like, hey, thank you very much. Sort of like a nice little endearing moment here at the beginning of the chapter. But eventually Sasaki just says like, hey, and now that you are a Grand Cross, I can officially make you a stand-in, right? As he pretty much explains like, hey, whoever's heading up Naraku City branch office has to at least be a Grand Cross. So finally, Sasaki can take a vacation of some peace of mind and put Kiyoshi in the power position here, pretty much, right? Akari's like, hey, don't tell me that's why you sent him to the exam in the first place, but Sasaki's like, hey, I'm not that low, like, I'm pretty low, don't get me wrong, but I'm not that low at the very end of the day, right? As he just eventually says, like, hey, that's, like, rude, don't, like, do that to me, right? But eventually, Kiyoshi's like, hey, I'll make sure you get some good rest and relaxation. Leave it to me, I'll be the best stand-in ever, right? And to this, Sasaki's like, hey, great, Kiyoshi, I will really be counting on you, right? We now cut to the next day where Kiyoshi and Nihon are both at school, and of course, being that Jack Joe is always there, he's in the background too. Pretty much we just see that Kiyoshi and Nihon are talking about going to a public bath after school. Just pretty much just talking like, hey, since the Gates of Hell restaurant is closed, we don't need to worry about like working there, so let's like spend some rest and relaxation time on ourselves while Sasaki's out of town doing the same thing. Maybe that's foreshadowing that Sasaki isn't, who knows? That's also just me knowing what happens at the end of this chapter, but whatever. pretty much everything goes on. Kiyoshi's just like, hey, going to visit a public bath for friends. I'm not worthy of your benevolence. We see he's like checking off one of his like bucket list things, being that Kiyoshi is like the whole list of like, because I'm so self-conscious, I've got things I haven't been able to do yet, but a little bit of a fun trope either way. And at this point, as Kiyoshi and Nihon are leaving the school, somebody appears in front of them. As we see it's this girl, and she just says like, oh, you're Kiyoshi Harai, aren't you? And we see that she's got an eye patch with like a pentagram drawn on it, and she's got like 2 really big ponytails and is in like a typical schoolgirl uniform, right? Nihon instantly recognizes her as a person named, I don't know why I just like missed this whole entire panel, named Rokuro Oka, or Ruruko Oka, right? Pretty much as we'll learn, she is the leader of the occult club, and she's pretty much noticed that Kiyoshi has all of his piercings and has like tattoos hidden and all that sort of stuff, and just asked him, hey, will you join my occult investigation club? Nihon's like, hey, an occult club, are you really interested in that stuff, Kiyoshi? And Kiyoshi's like, I'm not really whatsoever, right? But we pretty much see that Oka, this girl, is just getting very, very upset at Nihon sort of butting in during all of this, right? And eventually Oka just says like, hey, you're one of us, right? And as all of this is sort of going on, she just says like, hey, you two really don't want to upset me. When my emotions overflow, I can't stop myself from awakening, right? Sort of like just building up the whole idea of like, yeah, these are just like some very edgy middle schoolers or something. I think all these characters in middle school, it may be high school, I'm not really mistaken, but it's either at junior high or middle school, or junior high or high school. It's somewhere in the range of all of that, right? Well, eventually Oka just says like, hey, even if you don't feel like doing it, at least come and check out our club room, right? And Nihon and Kiyoshi are like, we don't want to, but we see that they pretty much get dragged into it anyway, right? We see the occult club room is like really creepy and a bunch of like various things going on there. And we see that Nihon and Kiyoshi are sort of like sitting on a couch with Jack Joe sort of like lounging around behind them, right? Nihon goes to like reach out and like touch some stuff, but Oka just says like, hey, be careful what you lay your hands on. You wouldn't want to accidentally unleash a demon of some kind, right? And Nihon's like, oh my gosh, for real? But Kyoshi's like, that's not how demons are summoned, so don't really worry about it, right? Well, eventually Oka just says like, hey, well, now then let's cut to the chase. Do you believe in the existence of demons, Kiyoshi Harai? And I love this moment as both Kiyoshi and Nihon look behind them to where Jack Joe is standing, and they both sort of like look up like, maybe, I don't know, but they don't like give a full confirmation, as Oka just says like, hey, I want to meet a demon, and Jack Joe comes over like, hey, you totally can, like, I'm right here, and she's like, I want to burn the side of it into my eyes, and Jack Joe's like really, I'm here beside you, right? But she also says like, hey, and with any luck, I also want to meet the natural enemy of demons, an exorcist, which that is what both of these two are, like, exorcists, right? And eventually she's like, hey, exorcists are so awesome. They serve God and battle demons as such cool heroes. And hearing this, Kiyoshi and Nihon go both to pull out their ID cards, which says they're exorcist on them. But Jack Joe's just like, come on, like, don't be stupid. Like, what are you doing all this, right? But Oka just says like, hey, and today's the day my final wish finally comes through. Today, we are going to summon a demon, right? And just is like, hey, I really wanted to share this grand occasion with you as well, Kiyoshi Harai. That's why I invited you here today. And Nihon sort of like asked Kiyoshi like, hey, is that something that they can actually do, like summon demons? And he's like, no, not at all. Like, only a few exorcists are capable of doing it, and they never teach their secret to outsiders. Like, it's impossible for a regular person to do it, so there's definitely no way in hell she's being true about this, right? Kiyoshi then just asks Oka, like, hey, can you tell me where you learned to summon such demons? And she says, like, oh, well, I'll let you know. She sees that this account somewhere called Pitch Black Fallen Angel taught her how to do it, pretty much. Like, hey, they're an influencer who exploded onto the occult scene like a bomb. Some people believe they're an honest-to-God psychic, right? And she's like, hey, it's a real deal. The entire gang here now goes up to the roof of the school building, where we see that on the roof there is so pretty much scrawled on is like, hey, devil come on, but the O in the word come is a pentagram instead, right? And she's like, hey, this is my demon summoning away, right? Or my demon summoning array. I don't know why I said that so weird. And she just says, like, hey, I spent a whole 20 minutes preparing it, right? And Johan's like, yeah, like, no demon's going to be summoned by this. Like, Kiyoshi, let's just leave. As Johan goes, like, turn to Kiyoshi. But Kiyoshi is sort of staying there, and he's like, wait, this summoning sigil is, like, legit. And, what in the world? Just who is that account that taught Oka about this, right? As we now cut away from the scene of where Kiyoshi's like, damn it, that's real. As we cut to Sasaki, on top of a building somewhere. As he's like, hey, look at that. No doubt about it. As we see his demon companion is beside him. Of course, this is the demon which has, like, the card suit motif, in a way. As the demon just says, like, yeah, my eyesight's 2015. I don't know if in Japan they've got, like, a different measure for eyesight. Because normally we have eyesight, like, 20/20 or, like, however that works. Like, that's perfect vision. Actually, what I have, a fun little Glowplasma fact, is that I've got extremely good eyesight. Like, I can read a lot of things from far away. I can come damn close to, like, counting individual leaves on trees from, like, a certain distance. Like, I've got some pretty good eyesight, but because of that, I've never had to go and, like, get my eyes tested at, like, a prescription. I have once, but I was, like, a lot younger, so I don't remember that whole process, and, like, being that I don't wear glasses, I don't know, like, how those prescriptions and all that stuff works. But as all of this sort of goes on, Sasaki eventually just says, like, hey, I can't believe he's really shown up. Sometimes the old man at the future shop actually gets it right. And his demon companion just is like, haha, you're pretty good at these kind of gambles, master. Sasaki just says, like, hey, shut it up, but, like, hey, whatever. But still, I finally found him. Yuta. As we got into a cafe where this guy who we obviously understand is now Yuta is like, hey, bartender, can I get 1 Vienna coffee, please? And the guy's like, oh, yeah, coming right up. And Yuta pretty much makes a little bit of small talk, like, hey, how long has this cafe been around? Oh, going on 30 years now. And he's like, oh, that's cool. I like your taste in music, and the aroma of coffee beans is so sophisticated, right? This kind of cafe, I'd like to come back to it sometime. As eventually we see that Sasaki walks into this restaurant and sits down on the opposite side of the booth where Yuta is sitting, right? And Sasaki just is like, hey, what are you doing here, right? As this guy just says, like, oh, are you going to be okay? This cafe is non-smoking, Mr. Sasaki, right? Sasaki's like, hey, sure, it's not going to be a problem. As Yuta just is like, hey, Sasaki just continues saying, like, hey, I'm only here to apprehend a wayward junior of mine. Yuta says, like, oh, I should have figured a former cross paladins are so cool. Sasaki just is like, hey, how about you? Are you walking around in broad daylight? After all, among us exorcists, you're wanted for being a traitor. And Yuta just says, like, hey, I just wanted to enjoy some coffee in peace. Besides, I'm not really worried. This city is full of trash. I can just take a hostage. As we see that he starts to summon some sigils on his arm, as all of a sudden, some cracks in the sky start to form behind him. As we see a little bit of a polearm comes in this moment and starts to pretty much spew out right in front of the face of this bartender here, right? And as the spear sort of gets launched out, we see that Sasaki's demon, the gambling demon sort of thing, reaches out, grabs the spear with his teeth and, like, halts it from moving any further, and then just sort of, like, grabs Urara in his sort of hand almost, right? And Yurta just said, or what was his name? Yuta. I think I've been calling him Yurta or something. Yuta then just says, like, hey, do you think you can protect everyone in this city like that? And Sasaki's like, hey, yeah, it won't be a problem. As we see that he drops some dice on the table, but then picks them up in the nick of time, pretty much. And that's where we end this chapter of Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi. I really wasn't in this chapter for, like, the grand majority of it until it was revealed, like, oh, hey, this is a legit summoning circle. Like, as much shit as, like, we could give this character and, like, oh, yeah, occult club stories, like, it makes sense being this is, like, an Exorcist manga and all of that. Having that sudden, like, realization of, oh, wow, this thing is real. And who is teaching people this? It's very interesting. And then sort of coming into the whole thing of, like, all right, who is this Yuta guy? What has he done? Why is Sasaki after him during his break, pretty much, right? Until we eventually get into the final notion of, like, oh, hey, so was Yuta the one who has this social media account online who is teaching all these people how to make these summoning circles? We don't really know, but it's a good amount of intrigue we get in this chapter, and I definitely liked Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi this week. With that, next up is Akane-banashi, chapter number 132. This chapter is titled Thinking Back. Of course, Akane just asked, of course, Master Urara, like, hey, what did the previous Shigema mean to them? Showing her the picture that she currently has of the previous 2 Shigema with their master, pretty much. And she's like, hey, bows, like, please tell it to me. As Urara just is like, hey, get in the car. We'll figure out something. And Akane's like, wait a second, get in the car. But eventually she sort of just follows Urara into the car. But that's really not what this chapter is about, as we suddenly start to move into a flashback, as we see that Urara starts to think, how long has it been since I last thought back on those years? Since I last thought about him. As we see some crows flying through the air, and we open up on the scene of 1964 Shinjuku, Japan. As we see the 2 boys are riding on a tandem bicycle, pretty much, or not really a tandem bicycle, just one of them's pedaling and the other one's sort of hanging on the bicycle, right? As we see one of them's like, hey, Aniki, hey, the times have changed. People like ramen more than soba now. You should know that, right? And the other one's like, hey, come on, you should know soba's better. And pretty much, as we'll learn, of course, this is Shigema and Isho. And pretty much Shigema's like, hey, well, look who thinks he's so gourmet. And Isho's like, hey, come on, it's gourmet, you idiot, right? But eventually they just start to banter about ramen back and forth, as they're eventually sort of like pointing around at some general areas, as they suddenly see a woman run out of a shop of some kind. Obviously, this woman is Urara, right? Or Urara, if I could speak a little bit, right? And we then see chasing after her are a few sort of like thugs, as they sort of like almost pin her up against the wall and just like, hey baby, don't just run away when I'm hitting on you. You trying to make me look so bad in front of everybody, right? And Urara just is like, hey, your face makes you look bad enough already. And this thug's like, hey, my pops is Yakuza who runs this whole area. The Kimuchuna dreaded of Shuekai, right? And he says like, hey, I'm Yakuza too, of course, so watch how you talk around me. As eventually, one of these guys, who is presumably, I think, Shigema is this one, just says, like, hey, come on, man, that's embarrassing. He's like, hey, who's gonna drop his dad's name when he hits on a woman, right? And this thug's just like, who the hell are you, right? As he just says, like, oh, who the hell are we? We're no one you've heard of. We're just a couple of ruffians. As we get a sort of like completed shot of these two, and we can see that Shigema is here, and we see Isho, and we see that Isho has on a soba shop Kui Hiko sort of like apron on, right? And we see that Shigema gets a good look at Urara, and is like, damn, she's really hot, like, she's a real looker, right? And I find it really funny being like, this is the 60s, the way he says it, like, damn, hot damn, that bird's a real looker, like, just this slang that I don't know if they actually used back then, but sort of like puts me into the fact that like, yes, this is that time period, I really do like it. But we see that Shigema's just like, oh dang it, my heart's racing so much I could bury myself alive right now, right? And Isho's like, hey, I wish you'd bury yourself dead, like, come on now, right? But at this moment, the ruffian just sort of starts to grab on Urara's arm and says like, hey, come on, forget those guys, baby, let's go. As Shigema sort of just like jumps in and says like, hey, Harry, who said you could manhandle her, right? Of course, making fun of this guy for having a lot of hair on his head, right? As eventually, Isho's like, damn it, what are you doing, that idiot, right? And he's like, damn it, you're in for it now, kid. As pretty much we see a little bit of a brawl ensues between Isho and Shigema, who are fighting all of these various ruffians, right? And eventually, we see that they completely took down all of these thugs around here, as we see that Shigema's just like, yeah, and for all their talk, those guys weren't much to speak of, right? And Isho's like, just shut up, man, right? And Shigema's like, hey, come on, it was fun, right? You have to admit that. And Isho's like, come on, you always snap at the first provocation. Like, you should just die in a hole, pretty much, right? As Urara is sort of just getting a good look at these two and just is like, wow, the two of them just really took on all of these guys? I really can't believe it, right? As we see Shigema walks up to Urara and just is like, hey, excuse me, miss, what's your sign, right? And Urara's like, is that really your first move to this guy? And he's like, hey, whatever. Would you like to go out with, me for tea? As, he showed sort of just corrects him like, hey, come on, it is tea with me, you absolute moron, right? And the show eventually just says, like, hey, come on, you can just ignore him. He's literally just a massive fool, right? And we just see that they get into a little bit of more banter back and forth, as Urara suddenly just turns to the show and just says, hey, you're very kind. Is this the book you're looking for? As we see that, of course, this was a book that Isho was holding earlier in the chapter, as she sort of goes to hand it to him, and she sort of pulls it back to his face as he starts to reach out for it, and just says, like, oh, hey, this is quite an advanced book for some soba shop worker to be reading, right? And Isho doesn't really take her shit, sort of, like, reaches down, picks up the book, and just says, like, hey, nothing is wrong with educating yourself on these matters, right? Shigema then just appears to be, like, a little bit of an agent of chaos as he's sort of being betrayed, or portrayed here, and he says, like, hey, but here's the thing, what's going on. Anaki's a terrible speaker, so none of it does him any good to begin with. He just thinks it makes him look really cool. Two of them get into some more some more bantering, and eventually we see that one of them was carrying a soba shop sort of thing for the soba shop that had some bowls in it, and now all of the bowls have been cracked and sort of ruined, right? And the two of them are like, hey, why you? And just bantering some even more, like, hey, you're going to pay for those. And he's like, how can I do that? I don't have any money. But eventually, Urara just is like, man, you brothers shouldn't be fighting around here. Like, I can pay for the bowls. It's the least I can do after you two saved me, right? We get a little bit of note of, like, hey, these two aren't actually brothers. But eventually, Urara's like, hey, there's plenty of money to go around. As I think in the best gag of this chapter, she bends down to where one of these ruffians is laying on the floor and goes to, like, pickpocket him pretty much, right? And the two of them are like, hey, that's not your money. Like, you shouldn't be robbing people, right? And she's like, hey, but beating up Yakuza is fine in the end. Like, just some really fun banter going on here. As eventually she just stands up, pulls money out of her pocket, and just says, like, hey, guys, I'm just kidding. Take this, it's my own money. And she said, like, hey, so long, you two. Thanks for the help, right? And Shigema's like, hey, what's your name, miss? And Urara says, like, hey, I'm not giving out my name to a couple of ruffians, right? And we see that she sort of starts to walk away in this moment. As we see that, who's his face, Isho says, like, hey, I'm sorry, it's really weird seeing the younger versions of these characters, so I'm, like, thinking, like, all right, what's her name? I'm like, wait a second, this is just a character that we have not seen look like this before. It's sort of just, like, catching me off of guard a little bit. But Isho's just like, hey, like, talk about opportunistic, man. Like, can you really blame her? No money, no education, not even anything to be able to replace a ceramic bowl? Me and you have nothing. As we now cut back into the car out of this flashback, as Urara's obviously just reminisced on all of these moments. And she just says, like, hey, Akane, you wanted to know about the old Shigema's children and what they meant by counterparts, right? Well, I can tell you about that. It all goes back to when the two of them had nothing. To the very first story of how they made their name in the arts. As our final panel we see is just an image of course, Shigema piloting his bike around, and of course, Isho sitting on the back, sort of reading his book as all this happens. This was such a fun chapter, all things considered. Like, I was sort of expecting to go into a flashback of Urara's, if I could speak. But it's just really fun to see how it's sort of portrayed, to see, like, the dynamic that these two brothers had when they were younger. And it really builds up to the idea of what tore these two apart. What happened to them, right? Which is just a really sad thing to think about, is, like, how could two people this close at such a young age become divided like this? Granted, I know that things like this happen all the time in the real world, but in a manga like this, it's just very interesting to see what has actually happened. And yeah, Akane proves to be Shonen Jump's best manga week to week. I don't know what else to say here, but yeah. Well, I wouldn't be talking about Jump today if Akane-banashi wasn't here, let me tell you that. Now, I guess you could look at that in two directions. Would I be talking about this issue of Jump, or, like, talking about manga in general today? Yes, I would be talking about manga in general today. And yes, I'd be talking about manga this week because Astro Royale was badass, as I call it, right? But with that, let's move on to Blue Box chapter number 170. This chapter is titled A Year Since Then. We start off with a color page where we see both Taiki and Chinatsu at a festival of some kind. Chinatsu is in her, what it is called, yukatas, and Taiki has one of those masks hanging off the side of his face, right? We start with this chapter of Blue Box by the guy who locked Taiki in the chamber, in the, what's it called last time, in the gym shed last time, is getting reprimanded by all of his quote-unquote friends, being that he should not deserve to have any friends for the evil shit he pulled last chapter. But we pretty much see all of his friends are like, come on, man, you shouldn't have done that. Like, you went way too far. Like, what are you thinking about that? At this point, we see that Haruto comes around a corner and says, like, oh, what are they doing to him? Like, should I come to his rescue? But while all this is happening, he hears what they're all talking about. Like, hey, I can't believe you locked Taiki and E.M.M.I in the shed. Like, hey, he kissed Shono last year, but now he's dating Kano. That's why he supposedly did it, right? And they're like, oh, yeah, I forgot that happened, yada, yada. Not a great excuse for doing that sort of thing, but still. But the most important thing here is for Haruto to now learn that Taiki has kissed Shono, which is something I totally forgot happened in this manga. I feel like I need to do a Blue Box reread, being that I have never gone back and read any of the chapters other than like the first like time and maybe like second time I ever read them. So I think I need to reread this series because it would probably do a whole lot of good for me in the very end of things, right? But eventually we cut now to the play that was going on around here, and we see that Hina is like clapping a bunch, like, oh, wonderful, such a beautiful play going on here. And she's like, man, the first year's renditions of Beauty and the Beast was great. And Nagi says just like, hey, with that kind of quality, I can't believe it was just a school event of some kind. Who's her face? Or no, is it Nagisa or is it Nina? Yeah, no, it's Hina and Nina. Nagisa is Chinatsu's friend, right? Hina and Nina, we didn't see that Hina just goes around and starts to walk out of the theater, just like talking with each other, as eventually she runs into Haruto, and she's just continuing to say it. Haruto just sort of like takes a look at her and sort of like stops in front of her, but eventually sort of like moves a lot more forward, as Nina just says like, man, he's so antisocial as ever. As we see this other guy around here is like, oh man, looks like Haruto can't keep his cool around her. As yeah, of course, we know what Haruto's emotions are, so yeah, it sort of makes sense in a little bit of a way. I would do the same thing probably, if I'm going to be honest with you. So yeah, we now cut over to where Taiki and Chinatsu are sort of standing around doing their thing, as we see that they've walked into a room that is the pop music club putting on a performance, as the two of them walk in like, oh, it looks like they just finished a set, and hey, that sure brings back memories, right? As Taiki just is like, I mean, yeah, it has been a year since we were last here doing this, right? And he just says like, hey, if I told last year's Taiki that me and you would be dating, he would be probably shedding tears of joy right now, right? And Chinatsu's like, oh, come on, you've got to be exaggerating with me, right? But Taiki's like, hey, no, I'm really not. Like, back then, I already really liked you, Chinatsu, right? And he's like, hey, being your boyfriend just brings me so much joy, almost so much as founding a nation, which I understand that as a guy. Like, I think there's 4 things we all want to do. I just made up the number 4 there, but I'm going to now figure out 4 things we all want to do. Have a really cute girlfriend, I guess, is the first one, or a wife eventually, however that works. Second is, yes, found a nation. If you met a guy who says he does not want to sit down and would not want to found a nation, I don't know who you'd be talking to. I think it's just one of those, like, primal male, like, feelings of, yeah, democracy, or maybe not democracy. Maybe I want to be another type of, like, dictator or something, but damn it, if I could found a nation, that'd be really cool. Another one of those things I think all men want to do is, like, have that really, really awesome moment of, like, I don't know if I can come up with 2 other ones that, yeah, whatever. This was a bad joke, all things considered, right? But eventually, Taiki just thinks back to this moment of like, hey, back then, like, whenever we were doing this last year, hey, you said something to me then. What was it, right? And Chinatsu just thinks about all of that, and of course she was saying something, but then the pop music festival was just so loud that she wasn't able to get it across. It's just like, oh, hey, that's a secret. And Taiki's like, hey, even after a whole year, this gets through to Chinatsu. She just says like, hey, I guess you're right, but I don't think it's really a big deal. But I just said I wanted to make memories with you, Taiki. As he just sort of thinks about this and thinks to that moment, right? And he's like, what do you mean? That's like a super huge deal. I don't know what you're going on about, Chinatsu, right? But eventually, Chinatsu just continues to say like, hey, after all, the Culture Festival is a memorable event. I think even when I get older, I'll probably still remember it. Oh, and the music. I have a feeling it will always remind me of back then. As we see the guy up on the mic of the pop music clubs, it's like, all right, guys, thank you. We are DD. Our first song is, and he sort of starts to like strum out and doing all of that sort of stuff, right? As Chinatsu just says like, hey, come on, Taiki, it's starting. And the two of them just stand there side by side, entranced with the music and with each other. As eventually, Chinatsu just thinks like, hey, even when I'm an adult, whenever I hear this song, I think I'll remember my high school culture festivals. As we see that she imagines her and Taiki as an adult together. We see that Taiki's putting on like a sports coat to presumably go out to work or something. And Shinatsu's doing some dishes or something at home. It looks like they're in the kitchen. And eventually it looks like later they're both sitting on the couch as some music is on the television together, right? As they're sitting next to each other. As Chinatsu just starts to think, hey, I wonder when that feeling of nostalgia starts. After months? After years? I always want to remember this, so I need to box it up carefully. As we see this small little image of Chinatsu just holding a box, presumably with this memory of her and Taiki together in it. As we get a montage of the two of them just going through the rest of the school festival. Walking around, we eventually see that the two of them finally get that final stamp that Taiki needed, even though it wasn't from her. Taiki still finally fulfilled it, and they just are having a great time. As she just thinks like, hey Taiki, let's create even more memories going forward. As we see this little panel of where Taiki and Chinatsu are standing together, and they're sort of in like a little bit of like a chibi version in a way, but we see that they're just stacking on boxes on top of boxes on top of boxes together. As we just see like, hey, even though there may be painful ones along the way, as we just see that she's putting together and she's putting memories in all these boxes and they're stacking them together. And there was not a scene that melted my heart more this week. If I could speak, man, it's just such a good moment of just seeing Chinatsu just come through and like, hey, I want to make memories with you, Taiki. And I just want to be with you forever. It's such a nice little moment, just showing how much these two care for each other in the end. Such a great chapter. Such a great moment. That's not the old chapter, though, as we get another, like, oh, my heart just got stabbed with an arrow. Like, why are you doing this to me? What is this author's name? Kojimura? Yeah, Kojimura. As we see that, of course, Taiki and Kyo are back into the swing of playing badminton and all that stuff. Is yes, the festival is now over on that brilliantly nice note of like, hey, putting all of our memories into boxes. As we eventually see as they are playing together, Taiki is like, hey, Kyo, are you all good? Like, I know you're still in the mend from your sickness there, right? And Kyo's like, hey, come on, I'm fine. He's like, it is sort of it is what it is. Taiki's like, hey, sorry you couldn't be there when you were having such a hard time. And Kyo's like, hey, you're fine, man. We then see that Ayame comes storming into the area, and she's like, hey, that does it. Who did all of this? As we see that all of the boys have, like, a water dispenser, and they're not closing the lid all of the way, so there's a bunch of water on the floor, as pretty much Ayame is very, very upset about this. She's like, come on, manners, you boys. Don't you show those in play, then show me here right now, right? And Kyo walks over and is like, hey, I'll remind him later also, so just don't do it all yourself, right? And Ayame's like, hey, no, come on, let me handle it. I'll make sure they know what hell awaits them next time, right? As Kyo's like, all right, that's fine, I understand, Ayame. As eventually, we see that Ayame notices something outside the door, and we see that it's Yuto Takasaga, of course, the boy she's dating right now. And she gives a little bit of a smile and sees him and runs up to him like, oh, hey, how's it going, right? And Tasakaga's like, hey, all I did was peek in real quick. Did I interrupt your practice? And she's like, no, we were taking a break, all things considered, right? And we can see all the badminton boys like, oh, hey, Yuto and Ayama sitting in a tree. These guys are in, like, middle of high school, like, or they are all second years pretty much. Like, come on. They should not be doing this at the ripe age of 17, but whatever. At this point, Ayame just sort of, like, goes chase them around doing all this sort of stuff, right? As eventually Kyo walks back over to Taiki, and Taiki's like, hey, pretty noisy here, right? And Kyo's like, hey, Taiki, you know what we were saying earlier? I may not actually feel fine. And Taiki's like, what? And Kyo just says, hey, I'm heartbroken. As he says this, of course, thinking about Ayame. I mean, what else would he be thinking about? As Taiki's like, oh, damn, man, that really sucks. As Kyo then just says, like, hey, it almost hurts as much whenever I lost after taking you deuce to deuce during our first high school year tournament, right? Sort of relaying that to a badminton thing so Taiki understands it better. And Taiki's like, hey, come on, man, that was your fault, right? But that is where we end this chapter of Blue Box. Like, this moment of, hey, I want to make memories together with you, and then eventually ending this out, like, Kyo, like, hey, I'm actually not fine. I feel really heartbroken, all of this. Like, it's like you put, like, a bunch of love into my heart, and then you ripped it out all in one instant. Like, such a nice little moment. Sorry if you can hear that. I normally have been recording with my window closed, but, it's really sort of hot in the room right now, so I'm sort of leaving it open to get some nice cold air from outside inside. And there's currently a, what's it called? An ambulance going on outside, so it sort of is what it is there, but I'm not closing the window. It doesn't really matter. And also, my roommate just entered the room, so sort of is what it is there. Man, they are really going out there with all the sirens, but, yeah, we're just going to finish the Blue Box segment over that, but yeah, just seeing this, actually, maybe not, Alright, those sirens were really, really loud, so I just paused the recording there for a second, but yeah, having this moment with just Taiki and Chinatsu being like, hey, let's make as many memories together as we can, and then eventually having Kyo have this moment of like, hey, I'm heartbroken. It's such an emotionally charged chapter of Blue Box, and honestly, looking back at my rankings of this week of Shonen Jump, I think I've got to move Blue Box up, like, 2 ranks, just because, like, I forgot how good this actually was until I went back and reviewed it, so let's just type that in the spreadsheet real quick, but you will see that, of course, at the end of the video, but yeah. Blue Box was just absolutely amazing. And if that, let's head on to the second last chapter. We move on to the Elusive Samurai, chapter number 178. This chapter is titled The Road to Shinano 1338. Alrighty, it is now a new day of recording this weekly Shonen Jump video. As you just heard, I think, introduced the Elusive Samurai segment, if I'm not mistaken, and pretty much that noise, I don't know if it came over the recording, I actually have not checked yet, but there was like an ambulance followed by like 2 police vehicles, followed by like a fire truck going down a road near me, and they were all just zooming by, so there's probably another 20 seconds after the audio cut off where you guys heard it, to where all of this stuff was just going on, and also my roommate had just entered the room, as you guys, as I just mentioned in the recording also. So with all of that being said, I ended up pausing the recording there, but that doesn't mean we're not going to finish talking about that issue of Jump. I mean, that is what I'm here to do now. So like I said, let's hop into the Elusive Samurai, chapter number 178. This chapter is titled The Road to Shinano 1338. Of course, at the end of last chapter, we had just really gotten introduced to this guy named Kosaka Takamune, and pretty much he's got a little bit of interesting design, and his whole thing is like, he's like, hey, Tokuyuki, I want to get in, like, good relations with the court, so please pretty much work with me here, right? As, this guy, we get reintroduced to him again, like Kosaka Takamune, and as everybody's sort of talking about, he eventually just says, like, hey, and all of this is to get ahead, of course, I'm a low-ranking warrior gambling on a big win, right? Of course, Ginba's like, oh, you're gambling, aren't you, right? And what is his name? Kosaka? Yeah, Kosaka pretty much just goes through and say, like, hey, despite the money I make in managing the lad, I'm very far down on the pecking order, but if I protect the prince and all of his court flourishes, my name shall shoot up in the ranks very, very fast, right? And he's like, so I figured the expense was worth it, so I rushed down the Tenryu River to come over to you guys, right? Ayako then asked the very obvious question of, all right, so if you're trying to protect the prince, why do you need our prince, Tokuyuki? Like, why do you need our lord, right? And Kosaka also has a decent enough answer for that, as he just says, like, hey, here's the thing. The prince would never accept a valid invitation from me, but Hojo could put me a good name, pretty much, right? And he's like, hey, if you can convince the prince to come to my territory of Ino Dono, to come to my territory if Ino Dono loses, right? Who is the other guy we got introduced to with, like, the big samurai helmet and, like, the really big head last chapter, right? And he also says, like, hey, and there's another reason, Currently, Tokiyuki, you do not have your own territory, but you have a small band of loyal followers. I can give you a place to live, and you can build and defend my fortifications, right? I'm military weak, and you guys are military strong. If we come together, things will be a lot better for all of us, right? So at this point, Shizuku eventually just is like, hey, where's your territory in Shinano? Kosaka pretty much explains it is in the Ogawara region, and it's very deep in the mountains, right? And Shizuku pretty much tells Tokiyuki, like, hey, that is very high up in the mountains, and it's, like, flowing with divine power. So it would be instrumental for helping Mima recover in the long run, right? So because of that, it's like, all right. Also, we get something out of this ourselves by getting Mima back up into a shape of some kind, right? At this point, Natsu appears again, and she makes, like, the brief little mention that she just scouted 120 kilometers to the east, which is, like, how fast you have to be going to, like, scout that far. Granted, we don't know how, like, far back she was, but it looks like she is moving really fast, of course, with her, vine sinews, pretty much, that let her shoot around really fast, right? She pretty much explains that, hey, a large, amount of enemy forces blocked away to Kanto, and the Hojo party can return to Izu, but Nita's territory in Kozuke is inaccessible without passing through Shinano, right? So Tokiyuki just, like, finally thinks about all of this various information here and just thinks, like, hey, here's the thing. Everyone is currently telling me to go to Shinano, but I disrupted the people of Shinano with all my fighting 5 years ago. So how could I go and face them all again, right? And, of course, in the typical, like, fashion of a manga, Kosaka just comes over to like, hey, Tokiyuki Dono, the final reason that you should come is that all of the people in Shinano still like you. At least I do, and all of the people in my area. We all willingly joined in on that fighting so many years ago, so no one represents the Hojo Lord for helping us demonstrate Shinano pride. Right, and Tokiyuki just really hears all of this. He just thinks, like, wow, this guy Kosaka is just calculating and open, but he's also very cheerful. And I think I can trust this young warrior. And perhaps the people of Shinano have come to me due to Suwa Myojin's guidance, right? As eventually Tokiyuki just makes a proclamation like, hey guys, I'll go with you to Shinano, right? But he eventually just says, like, hey, but before I do that, Tosaka, I must stop by Izu to let all of my soldiers go home, right? And he pretty much tells all of his soldiers, like, hey, here's the thing, guys. You guys go home, and after you guys are all fully rested, come lend me your strength in Shinano, right? And he's like, hey, but also stay in Izu and support your families if you have an heir or have wife or children, right? And eventually he goes up to one of his military people and just is like, hey, Sugura Shiro, treasure your time with your children, and I'll need your strength again someday. Until then, care for all of the people of Izu, right? Pretty much all of this happens, and Tokiyuki just is like, hey, all of you did great on this lengthy expedition. I'm very proud of your service to the Hojo. Pretty much thank you for all of the time and effort that you've put in here, right? And eventually Tokiyuki goes over and just talks to the prince himself, just saying like, hey, and as for you, if things get really different, come to Shinano and we will make sure to protect you, right? Like, hey, I and your loyal subject Kosaka will prepare an impenetrable castle for you guys, right? This guy who was, E or whatever his name was, or Yu, he pretty much just gets all the way in Tokiyuki's face, like, why are you challenging my authority? You have the right to control me around. Shizuku pretty much shows the scroll that came from Emperor Godaio, pretty much saying this Tokiyuki can do whatever the hell he wants to, right? And he is not very happy to see this, but eventually, what is the guy's name? Prince Mukinoshi just is like, hey, E, it's very much authentic. My father spoke very joyfully of it, right? Of course, since Emperor Godaio does like Tokiyuki a little bit, right? At this point, Prince what was his name again? Prince Muneyoshi just is like, hey, we understand what you're doing, Tokiyuki, and we of the Imperial family are sworn defenders, right? And like, Kosaka, I will rely on you if necessary, and Kosaka really just blushes hearing all of this, right? Pretty much the Elusive Warriors and all of their members of the army make it over to Izu, everybody goes and see their families, and most importantly, Tokiyuki is able to see Yasuye again, of course, his uncle, and also his aunt, or his aunt's want removed or whatever. He gets to see Yasuye's mother also, who is there, right? And Yasue just like sits down and asks Tokiyuki like, oh, hey Tokiyuki, are you still capable of fighting? And Tokiyuki's like, yes, I totally am. And Yasue just says like, oh, and so am I for another 10 years. Stay on the move and do not rush for success. But of course, being that Yasuye's whole joke, we see on his forehead is written Isol, which pretty much just means I am lying, right? So it's a little bit of a nice little funny moment here where not only like a little bit of emotional, because like, hey, we got to see Yasuye again, and like, I actually didn't think we were going to be able to see Yasuye for the whole fact of like, it clearly said like, hey, after the moment where he went with his mother away and after Tokiyuki sort of drove him away, the history books never spoke of him again, but very interesting, all things considered. At this point, the Elusive Warriors all make it back to Shinano or Suwa, whatever you want to call it. And Tokiyuki and all of the Elusive Warriors just think, wow, I never thought I'd lay eyes on this land again. As Kosaka's like, hey guys, we're here now, like, so please come inside this little hovel. And Genba's like, hey, why are we staying here though? Suwa Grand Shrine isn't that far whatsoever. And Kosaka's just like, hey, there are other reasons for not going there right now, so we'll speak to Myojin-sama here. And Tokiyuki's like, wait a second. As we go inside the house, and we see, of course, none other than Suwa Yoritsugu, age 10 now, is sitting here. We haven't seen this kid in like 100 chapters or something like that. It's been a very, very long time, right? And Yoritsugu is just like, oh, ho, ho, Tokiyuki, you finally come to rely on me again. And Tokiyuki just comes in and gives him a big ol' hug and just is like, hey, I'm so glad you're alive and you've gotten so big, Yoritsugu, right? And Yoritsugu doesn't look very happy to say all of this. But eventually we cut into more of like a strategy meeting of some sort, as Tokitsugu just says like, or Yoritsugu just says like, hey, tactically, I very much approve of Kosaka's plan. Protecting the prince is crucial for us resisting Takeuchi. However, you and Kosaka must do it on your own. We cannot cooperate for fear of breaking an obligation. And everybody's like, an obligation? What are you talking about? As Yoritsugu just simply explains, hey, after fighting, Suwa is punished. A real scoundrel was appointed Lord of Suwa Grand Shrine, and he exiled me, and I fled in fear of my life. As we pretty much see that this really fucked up leader is taking a bunch of the girls from the Suwa Grand Shrine and presumably doing some not very good stuff to them, pretty much like holding all of them, and they don't look very thrilled about it. And we see Yoritsugu is just sitting in a cave when all of a sudden a head gets thrown on the ground. And Tokitsugu just says, hey, and that's when a certain someone saved me. Sadamune. And we get a little bit more narration to end off the chapter just saying, hey, after that, 2 years passed. The historical records tell of the final battle between Hojo Tokiyuki and Osagawara Sadamune. And that is where we end this chapter of the Elusive Samurai. I think this is a fine chapter, all things considered. Like, it is sort of very nice to, like, be moving on, sort of get one of these action wrap-up chapters, everything after everything that we just saw happen in the Elusive Samurai. And eventually, it looks like the final confrontation between Sadamune and Tokiyuki is going to be happening now, which is very, very interesting, being that Sadamune has been the one antagonist and like helpful ally that we've had for the entire series. I mean, since like chapter 6 or something, when they were like doing the whole dog hunting thing or whatever. Either way, very, very good chapter of the Elusive Samurai, all things considered. With that, we have one more chapter to talk about, and of course that is Witch Watch chapter number 177. This chapter is titled, Get Rich Quick, an Easy Primer on X-Ray Vision. This is another comedy chapter of Witch Watch, but a very, very good one, all things considered. We see that it looks like Nico is coming home from school one day and meets Bon outside of the Otagi household. And we see some guy is just walking by with sort of like some dark determination in his vision almost, right? And Nico pretty much explains like, hey, I think I sense a butterfly from that guy over there. As we see that this guy sort of closes his eyes, then opens them up and looks over at Bon, right? As eventually, he almost just starts to go down and he hits the ground and just vomits all over the ground. And Bon's like, what in the world are you doing, right? We cut forward in time as we see that Nico goes, extracts the butterfly from this guy and says, oh, hey, the spell that he had was a spell called Transparency. It's a spell that gives X-ray vision, pretty much, right? And Bond pretty much gets a little upset, like, hey, X-ray vision, were you trying to see me naked, you, like, you skis or whatever she calls this guy. And this random guy just says, like, yeah, I was trying to, but this spell is really too hard to use. You have to close your eyes for a specific amount of time, and then depending on how far you close them, you can open them up and see a certain amount of distance from there. Pretty much, a second is worth 10 centimeters, so if you close your eyes for long enough, you can see some stuff, right? And this guy pretty much explains that it's very hard to, like, gauge the distance between them, so by the time you close your eyes and open them back up, most of the time, you aren't going to be able to see something too good. As eventually, as all of this goes through, this guy pretty much explains, like, hey, whenever I was trying to look at your chest, Bond, what ended up happening was I closed my eyes for too long, and I opened them up, and I saw all of your insides and stuff, and I just vomited on the spot, right? And Bond's like, I guess spells are super, super finicky, right? And Nico then just says, like, hey, it may be hard to use, but there are a handful of people who have mastered it. People who had really good, like, spatial awareness. They could get these really crazy insight of flashes, right? And he says, like, hey, and that insight lets you judge the distances down to 0.0000001 millimeters, right? Like, and hey, they call it a cracked flash, right? Of course, sort of a joke based on the Black Flash from Jujutsu Kaisen, right? Cracked Flash is what they're calling it here, right? Bond then asks Nico to cast a spell on her, and Bond does it, right? Or Nico does it, puts spell on Bond. Bond tries it, and pretty much looks into Nico's pocket on her overall she's wearing, and sees a little handwritten note from Moi or a handwritten note to Moi that she has in there, just says, like, hey, thank you for everything, Morito, right? At this point, we cut inside the Otoge household, where we see that most of the guys are sitting around playing cards with Bond. We see that Keigo, Miharu, and Kanchi are all here, and we see that Bond is just overwhelmingly just winning right now, right? And everybody's like, what are you doing here, right? And Bond eventually just says, like, hey, I'm using the X-ray vision, right? And we see this thing where she is just very good at this for the reason that she is a dragon, so because of this, she has access to echolocation, which means she can judge distances very, very well. We see a joke where whenever one of the guys is talking to her, like, come on, Bond, what the hell, right? We see that she just takes a look at them, and we see all of their clothes are just off their body in this instant, and both Keigo and Kanchi are like, come on, what are you doing this for? And I really like how Bond has just, like, her eyes really spaced out whenever she does this, right? But eventually, Bond just says, like, hey, either way, I'm on a massive hot streak right now, cracked flash after cracked flash, and I can just see through about anything that you guys want, like, hey, you name it, and I'll strip it bare for you guys, right? And eventually, she just says, like, hey, I'm going to take advantage of this as much as I can. I found my bottle of booze that Morito hid. I can tell which pot sticker has my favorite filling, and I can grab all my favorites pretty much, right? And she eventually just says, like, yeah, I'm using this for a lot of not great things. And Miharu eventually asks, like, hey, well, can you not think of, like, a more effective use for this power? And Bond just thinks, like, well, that was sort of the thing. And she sort of looks around and just like, hey, do you guys know where Morito and Nico are? Miharu explains that those two are at class. So Bond pretty much explains, like, hey, here's the thing. Nico was supposed to, like, dispel the spell on me, but she forgot because I was mostly distracting her, right? Here's the thing. The spell won't wear off naturally until tomorrow evening. I want all of your best money-making schemes now. And all of the guys are like, are you really just trying to abuse it like this? It's a really funny joke that we get here, right? And they're like, we shouldn't be going along with this, but Bond says, like, hey, if it works, I'll give you three all cut. And then they all instantly grab sunglasses, put them in, and they're like, all right, we're in, right? So yeah, they're trying to make as much money as they can. They have a little bit of a strategy meeting, pretty much going through all of the various things that they are thinking about. Eventually, they're just saying like, hey, we could like see inside of like a raffle machine, but knowing what number is the correct one in there doesn't mean anything for us if we don't put the thing down or whatever. And hey, poker and mahjong games that involve real money betting are illegal in Japan, so we can't do that either. Until eventually, Miharu just thinks like, hey, the most realistic plan maybe would be scanning those Choco Big blind boxes in the store to find those secret things and then selling them on the overhand market after it, right? And Morito's like, or no, not Morito. Keiko's like, wait, that's actually a great decision. Like, maybe if we just get like a blind box item that sells for a lot of money on the other side of the market. Collectible card games is what he eventually comes to, right? And pretty much what Miharu and they all do some research, like, wow, he's right, he did a search for trading card price lists, and there are dozens selling for hundreds of thousands of yen, right? As they're like, hey. And they show, like, the most expensive one in this card game, it's called. The Wandering Merchant of the Desert sells for over 1,000,000 yen, which is over $1,000 USD, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, why could a card sell for that much, right? And they pretty much say, like, hey, sometimes the card art is second to rarity. Like, if a really rare card is sought after, that's why it's sought after, right? And we see this card game is something called Dungeons and Wizards, right? So pretty much the entire gang goes to a card game shop, and they find 3 ultra rare cards, right? They find one called Archangel of the End, Lightning Ring, and Find Fault, right? Pretty much everybody's like, wow, this is such a really awesome thing here. And they walk into the Morito house or to the Otogi house talking about all of this various stuff, right? And Bond just says like, hey, we only hit 3 big ones and I only had to scan 170 packs. Like I was getting cracked flash after cracked flash, right? And Miharu says like, wow, look at this. Like according to the card marketplace, we should be able to sell these for about 7,000 yen, which is about $700, which 70,000 yen, $700, which isn't bad whatsoever, right? And Bond's like, hey, if all of this works, I'll go out tomorrow morning and hit up all of the various card shops that I can find, right? And Keiko's like, hey, that's great. We'll all catch up with you after school to help you out, right? And they're pretty much just talking about all of this, like, hey, let's just make more money. As they walk into the house, Morito says, like, hey, what are you guys talking about? Selling all these cards to make a lot of money, right? And Morito pretty much gets the wrong sound of it, just as like, hey, so you're making money on X-ray fission? Is that what you're doing? Like using a credit card to fund research? It seems way too ambitious to me. Obviously not really understanding what's going on here, right? It is now the nighttime and we see that Nico is going to bed. And of course, being that Bond is sleeping with her, she curls up into her dragon form and is just laying on the bed, simple as that. And she's just laughing like a whole lot. And Nico's like, hey, you sound really happy, Bond. And Bond's like, oh, it's no big deal, right? And she eventually says, all right, good night. I'm closing my eyes. And she does it. And she finally wakes up the next morning, jumps up for joy, and just like, man, I've got a really busy day ahead. Like, I've got to hit up all of the card shops I can find before I can't see anything anymore. And as she wakes up and looks out in front of her, she sees a great expanse of nothing and just a few silhouettes of buildings in the background. And Bond realizes, oh no, did the spell count all of the time while I was asleep? No, that's not good whatsoever. And she just thinks like, no way. How many seconds does that come out to? Like, what time did she look around like, oh no, all of the clocks are transparent. What am I ever going to do, right? And she just thinks like, man, maybe I can do the mapping and figure it out. She's like, I can't even do that, right? And of course, she can't see anything like in specific as we get a little bit of an explanation like, hey, the answer is 3,600 meters, and Bond can see through absolutely everything up to 3 kilometers away, right? So Bond's not particularly doing too well, as she's just like yelling and screaming. And the final punchline of the chapter is because of all of this, Bond can't see anything, And the final image is just her running towards everybody, and of course she can't see anything. And she is doing the pose of the wandering merchant of the desert card, right? And she's just like, help me! And the narration just says like, hey, and after all of that effort, Bon acquired an ultra rare experience. And that is where we end this chapter of Witch Watch and thus all the art chapters this week. This was a fun chapter, don't get me wrong, but at the same point, it's really just based on this comedy joke of, like, Bon doing this. And I think Kento Shinohara did a very good job on a punchline, making it to where it's like, okay, that's a pretty good way to end this chapter and stop Bon from completely abusing this power anymore. Is because she's a moron at points and just sees through everything for a while. A really funny joke that I think had some great execution to it, right? But with that, yeah, that's all the chapters this week. So with that, let me go over to OBS and let's open up. Let me do things correctly. Let me go to my window capture. Yeah, this one right here. Perfect. All right. So we should now be looking at the spreadsheet now. I think we're there. Yeah, we're over here. So as you see, issue number 48 here. Like I said, there was only 13 chapters this week, which was sort of a nice change of pace. Which means that even if I did do a full video on Shonen Jump, I would have only really been talking about 12 series since Kagurabachi. I do its own separate video out to the side. But yeah, this is how I ranked everything this week. Of course, all of the chapters that I talked about, I ranked up in these top 7 slots. So like you see here, Akane-banashi was my chapter of the week. You cannot sit down and tell me that you did not enjoy seeing the dynamic between those two and just saying that like it wasn't purely amazing. Like I said, Astro Royale, as you see here for these past few weeks, has been ranking all the way near the bottom. But for some reason, just that chapter this week with Harumi Poseidon, I don't know why. I just absolutely loved it. And as you see down here, I picked Harumi Poseidon as my character of the week because I just thought he was just so stupid and so fun. I could not help pick him, right? Next up was Boo Box. That moment of just, hey, I want to make memories with you. It just really affected me in a really good way, I think. And at the end of the day, Kyo being like, yeah, Taiki, I'm not doing too good. I'm heartbroken over Ayame. It also hits at the end of the day. Kagurabachi had an absolutely amazing chapter, but of course, I didn't talk about it. Hunter x Hunter, another great chapter. Prince Hulkenberg is apparently dead. Like, what in the world? All of this stuff's crazy, except he isn't, but like his real body is. I don't know. It was just an absolutely crazy chapter, all things considered, but very, very good chapter of Hunter x Hunter. Then going into Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi, Witch Watch, and Elusive Samurai. Other three I talked about, I gave you my thoughts on them. Going on to Ichi the Witch, Undead Luck, Hematin, Kill Blue, and Shinobi Undercover. Like I said, I don't think there were any bad chapters this week necessarily, but just some of them weren't as good as others, and like I said, these first few were like, they were good. Like, I enjoyed Ichi the Witch, but I didn't feel like talking about it this week. I've talked about it every time I've done one of these videos since that series has been out. But yeah, good issue of Jump, all things considered. And yeah, I think that's all we're doing on the spreadsheet. Again, Akane-banashi, Astro Royale, Blue Box, Kagurabachi, Hunter x Hunter, Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi, Witch Watch, Elusive Samurai, Ichi the Witch, Undead Luck, Hematin, Kill Blue, and Shinobi Undercover. Akane-banashi was absolutely amazing. And then Harumi Poseidon was character of the week for issue number 48 here. But yeah, with that, let me stop the recording here. Stop recording. Yes, I want to stop recording. Look at that. I think I'm really liking using OBS for all this stuff. I'm getting in sort of the use of doing it, but yeah. With that, thank you guys so very much for watching this video on Weekly Shonen Jump, issue number 48 of 2024. Good issue, all things considered, like I've talked about plenty of these times. But if you enjoyed hearing my review of this issue and this mini episode of the series, I've got plenty other issues I've talked about on the channel. The past few have all been these mini reviews, and they will probably continue to be these mini reviews until I get really caught back up with Shonen Jump in general, because, hey, an hour video is a lot more easier to put out on a sort of daily to weekly basis, instead of a 2 hour and 30 minute, close to 3 hour video at the end of the day. So you are probably going to be getting some more of these mini episodes, but I promise we will have some longer episodes where I talk about like 17 series in one video. Those will all be back at some point, right? Yeah, but I'll have that playlist linked down in the description down below, also on the card. And also, if you guys don't know, this show is a podcast on all podcasting platforms, under like the weekly, or Let's Talk About Weekly Shonen Jump. I know it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean. Really, if there's a podcast out there I talk about, this show is probably on there somewhere. So hey, if you don't always like watching my YouTube videos, maybe you want to check out this podcast on the podcasting platforms. But yeah, with that, thank you guys so very much for watching. Leave me your thoughts and comments down below on what you guys thought about this issue of Weekly Shonen Jump. And yeah, with that, I really don't have too much else to say. Again, thank you guys so very much for watching. And yeah, this was issue number 48 of 2024 of Weekly Shonen Jump. And I'll probably be catching you guys next time for issue number 49 of 2024 next time. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. And Akane-banashi continues to be Shonen Jump's best manga. This will be Glowplasma 231, signing out.